Hello, this is a bit of a post-mortem for my game, PokerWar, that I made for the first MizJam on itch.io. Um, the challenge of the jam was that we were provided an asset pack. Everybody got the same asset pack, and the results were basically judged on your creative use of that asset pack, as well as how enjoyable the game was and how polished it was. Um, the asset pack provided was I believe it's called the 1-bit asset pack from Kenny, which had quite a few different individual sprites. The ones that caught my eye were the card sprites. Um, I'm a bit of a poker player, and on top of that, I've made two projects in Godot before. The first one was a very simple um, 2D arena shooter, and the second project was a card engine that would be used for a game like Slay the Spire. So I thought I could probably reuse those card utilities to make a pretty good game for this jam. So I decided to make a poker-based game. I had three ideas originally. The first one was an infinite runner where you try to pick up cards and actually make a poker hand to get bonuses. The second one was a game I called Cheater Poker, where it's like a normal poker game with lots of options to cheat, and the bad guys can cheat too. And it's kind of a deduction game because, if you see two aces of spades in play, you can deduce that one player is a cheater. Um, and you can basically, would have kind of a Wild West theme, and you'd have kind of a brief amount of time where you could shoot cheaters at the table, um, and basically get all of their money that they had in the pot for free. Um, and of course, you could cheat as well, but you had a chance of also being shot. And the third idea was basically a one-on-one poker match with no betting. But instead of getting two whole cards, you would get three, and you'd use one of those three cards to play a round of war at the beginning of each street of a hold'em poker round. And if you lost that war, you'd lose a heart. Both players would have 3 lives. The enemy players probably have variable lives depending on a variety of factors, but ultimately the base game is both players have 3 lives. And if you make it to showdown, whoever has the best poker hand wins, and then you carry on to the next round. This is the idea I ended up going with because it seemed like the easiest potential one, and I kind of came up with a theme to it, kind of a dark theme of this guy going to this temple trying to get the Necronomicon so that he could bring his wife back from the dead or something, and he has to like pass all these guardians or whatever. But the base game, because ultimately, you have to have realistic goals for a jam idea, was basically just a one-on-one poker round. Um, I even had an idea for the basic AI for the first opponent would be that he would always play the highest card of his whole cards for the war round. Um, so I figured that would be pretty simple to implement. Uh, Ultimately, I lost a lot of time trying to use my card tools because I did not have it ideally organized to have more than one card player in the game. Because, like I said originally, it was kind of designed with like a Slay the Spire one player card game in mind. Um, and I probably wasted close to 6 hours trying to implement my old card engine before deciding to rebuild it for this project. Um, that was a little bit tedious because I had to worry about getting the 52 cards in and uh, just the implementation I had for it, it made it pretty easy to add the stats and everything to the cards, the value and the suit. But I had to manually rename a lot of files in order to make everything kind of jive together. Um, but overall, getting the basic table implementation, especially with my old code for reference, was not that hard. Um, that being said, it took me about 24 hours to get just the basic table implementation so that uh, the table could display all the cards and the player's hands could display all the cards necessary. It was really neat the way I organized the structure, because by making each player object, so the, the main player and the opponent, be in the same group, I could do funky things from the main game loop, like just tell both players to draw 2 cards and using a group call, which I thought was pretty cool. Um, I ran into some problems just based on simple syntax errors, and I ran into other problems trying to, especially the biggest milestone that I had to kind of cross was developing a way to assess the hands. And I had limited experience using the sort functions and the various array functions for sorting that out. And it actually, uh, in my humble opinion, is a fairly complicated process to go through a hand and figure out if it's a straight, a flush, 2 pair, full house, etc. And at the same time be able to retain which player has what hands, compare those hands to each other. It ended up being a lot more complicated than I predicted, and ultimately, because I was like probably at around 22 hours, I decided to not count. I made like a separate project to kind of work on just doing a sort for that, and I decided not to count it towards my time. And then I found that I had spent 4 hours or 5 hours just working on that, and I was like, okay, this is kind of ridiculous. And the actual literal time, as opposed to the 48 hours restricted of total development time, the actual real time I had, the amount of days, etc., was becoming a factor. So I could game the system by not counting my learning as my game development all I wanted, but ultimately I would not have had the time to finish. So I decided to cancel. I submitted the game incomplete, basically, and I'm still kind of working on it because all those array sorts and everything, they're definitely going to be very useful to implement for future projects, and I think just having a good understanding of how that works is going to be useful to me for game development. Uh, Overall, I really enjoyed working on it though, because one, it got me familiar with my own card engine, a project that I kind of dropped a few months ago, and um, it was just a really good reintroduction to Godot after not doing a project for a year. And ultimately, I hope that in fact this kind of inspired me, because there was an incredible lack of documentation on a lot of the array functions. For example, I was trying to use sort for cards, but ultimately the cards were a bunch of instances stored in an array. So the value I needed to compare in them wasn't the actual value of the items in the array, because those were just nodes, and ultimately it would sort them by their node number, which wasn't very useful to me. So I had to figure out custom sort, which at the time of this recording has some really crappy documentation and not a particularly useful example of how that code works, unless you really dig into it and figure out that the example in the docs comes from code that was posted that was submitted as example code, but it was put into the example incomplete and out of context. So it took me forever, and I asked people on a couple of different Discord channels and everything. Eventually, I figured out how it worked, and it's actually pretty useful to use the custom sort in situations like this because I can look at each element by their variables, the variables contained in the instances in this case for comparison. But at the same time, the sort function is very limited, and I have to still do a lot of iterations and loops to assess card values between comparing two hands. And ultimately, I think that even if I knew what I was doing, the real complex part isn't the assessing the hands, but actually developing an AI for the computer opponents so that they logically play their hands. And I'm not even entirely sure if the game balance thing will work very well because obviously playing the war each round kind of puts you in a situation where a lot of the time it just makes the most sense to use the highest valued card in your hand in order to try to win the war round. So ultimately, though, I think this game could be potentially a semi-commercial or at least a decent game for release, whether or not it's free or for sale or whatever. And it could probably easily be ported to mobile devices. Um, there's a lot of potential features that I kind of thought of, but immediately wrote off because it's very important, I'd say, when doing a game jam to have like a base game in mind, and then if you get to that stage, that's when you should start worrying about additional implementation. But I had some ideas for like player power ups because there's no betting rounds in this poker. If you win, uh, you could get like things that would allow you to see your opponent's hand or stuff like that, but had like cool off periods so they didn't work every round. All sorts of stuff like that. So it had a lot of potential to be a cute little game, and I still might see that potential through. Currently, I'm trying to work on just organizing hands properly and maybe a very basic AI. But yeah, overall, I consider this a pretty successful failure. It's just ultimately um, the uh, time that I lost trying to implement my older code and the sheer lack of experience I had in the AI development and the assessment of the cards and manipulating arrays became a huge detriment. But at the same time, I think ultimately my approach was sound. I just have limited experience, so I'm hoping to actually maybe release a video series on how to make this specific project when I'm done. Just because there's not a lot out there for this type of game. The closest I can see would be the match 3 game by Mr. Taft Creates channel, and yeah, and I think that's basically it because most games that you see tutorials for are often of an actiony, like action RPGs or side scrollers or top down type things, and they don't involve a lot of array manipulation and assessing what objects are where and stuff like that. So there's not a lot of stuff out there for examples to make puzzle games or to make card games and stuff like that. So I think that even though I'm a pretty inexperienced Godot user and game designer, I think there would be some value both to me and my audience if I um, basically went through making the whole card component for a game like this, and including the assessment part, which I'm still working on, kind of making a relatively simple, easy to read, and somewhat modular method. So I might start development on that soon. I actually bought a second monitor, anticipating maybe trying to make a more active YouTube channel. So anyway, that's all I have to say about this project. And there's a link to the itch.io at the bottom. And if you go to the itch.io page, if you're interested in seeing the source code for the jam version of this game, it should be posted there as well. Thanks a lot.